Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome to part one of my lecture on chapter 17, water pollution. We do have about 59 slides, I think there are in this chapter. So I will do it once again in two parts, part one and part two, with part one starting right now. So once again, chapter 17, water pollution. Here we go. All right, so let's start off with talking about a core case study. This is discussing the Gulf of Mexico's annual dead zone. So we actually spoke about this a bit in previous units, talking about this eutrophication that occurs in water when you have excess nutrients and excess pollution in the water. So spring and summer bring huge inputs of nutrients from the Mississippi River Basin, right? The Mississippi River Basin, not only the Mississippi River, but the Ohio River comes into the Mississippi River, and we have a lot of farmland in this area. And so as a result, the farmers use the nutrients, right, the fertilizers on their crops. And what happens is the spring and summer rains washes that fertilizer off into these rivers that are part of the Mississippi River Basin. They all flow into the Mississippi River and then out into the Gulf of Mexico just south of New Orleans. So what happens? An explosive growth of phytoplankton that eventually die and then are consumed by bacteria, right? Those decomposers. Well, because of that, the decomposers using all the oxygen, right? Because the bacteria love this stuff, it ends up depleting the oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico's bottom layer of water. This results in dead zones that contain little marine life. What happens then in the winter is that storms then redistribute the oxygen around the Gulf of Mexico, and the dead zones basically die. Again, the winter storms will cause the wind and stuff will cause the water to kind of churn up, and that will redistribute the oxygen. The dead zone goes away, and then every spring and summer, the dead zones kind of pop back up again. So what are we talking about? We're talking about this area right here, okay, just south of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. And again, this is the entire Mississippi River Basin, right? A huge swath of the country. All those rivers drain into the Mississippi River at some point. And so you have all the nutrients coming from farmlands in the middle of the country eventually make it out into the Gulf of Mexico and cause this area with very low oxygen and therefore call a dead zone because fish cannot live there. This causes a huge problem for people in southern Louisiana. They rely on fishing for their livelihoods, and every summer they really have a hard time catching fish because this dead zone ends up popping up. Again, because of all the nutrients in the water, basically water pollution is what we're talking about here. All right, so something to think about. Let's take a closer look at the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Again, the level of nitrates discharged from the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico has tripled since the 1950s. Again, this causes a severe depletion of dissolved oxygen. That's what a dead zone is. Food web disruption. Many species cannot migrate away from the area that has this dead zone, and so they die. This causes the deaths of seabirds and marine mammal species that depend on the dying fish and the shellfish for food, right? The bottom of the food chain begins to go away, and then the whole food chain collapses, or the food web collapses, and then the animals higher up on the food web, on the food chain, end up having problems as well. Human factors. Dredging and straightening increases the flow of nutrients, and the removal of wetlands. We've talked about this before, that act as a filter for pollutants. Because we're removing those wetlands, a lot of those pollutants do not get filtered out and then end up in the Gulf of Mexico, and then that dead zone is created. So what are the causes and effects of water pollution? The chief sources of water pollution are agriculture, industry, and untreated wastewater. And what we mean by untreated wastewater is basically wastewater coming from sewage plants, okay, where basically what we our feces and our urine and things like that, all right, end up in these wastewater plants. And if we don't treat the wastewater, obviously that is a large source of water pollution. Water pollution causes illness and death in humans and other species, and again disrupts ecosystems, as we discussed briefly with the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. So Water pollution comes from point and non-point sources. I believe we did briefly talk about point and non-point sources in a previous unit. What are they? Basically, water pollution is a change in water quality that can harm living organisms or make water unfit for human use. A point source is where we know where the pollution is coming from. So a point source pollution is a discharge of pollutants at a specific location. So example, factories, right? Animal feedlots, underground mines, oil wells, oil tankers, okay? We know exactly where the pollution is coming from. It's coming from one of those things or something else, right? Another example. And so we call that a point source. We know the point where the source of the pollution is coming from. Then we have what's known as non-point sources. These are broad, diffuse areas. So for instance, rainfall or snowmelt washes pollutants from land into surface water. So runoff from fertilizers and pesticides from croplands, logged forests, lawns, golf courses. Again, we don't know exactly which golf course, right, that certain pollutant comes from. We don't know exactly what farm that certain fertilizer comes from, right? But so what happens is we have this runoff, and so we call it a non-point source because we can't pinpoint exactly the source of a specific pollutant in the water because, again, it's coming off of many croplands. It's coming off of many golf courses and many lawns, right? These fertilizers or sediment, which we'll talk about in just a bit. So that would be an example or examples of non-point source pollution. What is the leading causes of water pollution? All right, main one is these agricultural activities. Sediment eroded from the land is a main source. And again, the fertilizers, pesticides, and bacteria from livestock and food processing waste, all right, lead to water pollution. What are other leading causes? Industrial facilities, basically plants, right, factories, mining, the untreated human wastewater that I spoke about previously, and plastics, all right? Plastics are actually becoming a form of water pollution. You've probably heard about those big plastic gyres that are out in the Pacific Ocean where all the plastics, all that garbage is being basically concentrated into a couple of different areas in the Pacific. So plastic is becoming a leading cause of water pollution as well. So here are just a couple examples, all right? Again, this is a point source water pollution from an industrial plant. Again, we know the exact point that the pollution is coming from, and that point would be this pipe. Here's another point source water pollution. This is acid draining from an abandoned open pit coal mine. Once again, we know the exact point of where this pollution is coming from. It's coming from this mine. So these are examples of point source water pollution. This would be an example of a non-point. This is just sediment that is in farmland that is running off and flowing into a stream. All right. Again, we don't exactly know at the end of the day here what farmland produced or gave what sediment or what type of pollution to the water. So we call it a non-point source. We can't pinpoint the source of the pollution. What I will point out is by weight, very important, by weight, sediment is the largest source of water pollution. And what is sediment? It's just pieces of soil, right, in the water. It doesn't necessarily have to have pesticides or fertilizers in it. Sediment itself is considered water pollution. And again, by weight, sediment is, okay, the largest source of water pollution that we have. So definitely make a note of that. All right, so what are the harmful effects of water pollutants? Why do we care? Well, most serious threats to stream and lake water quality. So mercury, okay, we talked about that in the previous chapter. Pathogens from broken sewer pipes can get into stream and lake water. Sediments, we just talked about, from land disturbance and erosion. Metals, and nutrients that cause oxygen depletion. All right, those are your fertilizers. Infectious disease organisms can then occur in these contaminated drinking water, and that an estimated of 1.6 million people every year die from these infectious disease organisms that are in contaminated drinking water. Now, again, here in the United States, especially here in Ardsley, we don't really think about not having clean water, right? We turn on our faucet anywhere we go, and clean water comes out. However, in many parts parts of the world, they do not have that luxury, and clean water is actually a big issue, finding clean water. And that's why almost 1.5 million or over 1.5 million people die every year by contracting an infectious disease from contaminated drinking water. And again, most of that will be in your underdeveloped countries. All right, so got a couple of tables here you need to look at. These are major water pollutants and their sources. I would definitely have a general idea of this chart. You're going to see the second page coming up in just a second. So again, let's just take a look. We have type and effect, an example, and the source of that pollution. So infectious agents, pathogens that can cause disease. Examples, bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasites. What's their major source in water pollution? Human and animal waste. We have oxygen demanding waste, right? This depletes the dissolved oxygen needed by aquatic species. Biodegradable animal waste and plant debris are examples. What are the sources? Sewage, animal feedlots, food processing facilities, paper mills. Plant nutrients, right, cause excessive growth of algae and other species. Examples, nitrates and phosphates. Where is this source? Sewage, animal waste, inorganic fertilizers. We then have organic chemicals, which add toxins to aquatic systems. For example, oil, gasoline, plastics, pesticides, cleaning solvents. Where do we get them from? Industry, farms, households. Inorganic chemicals can also add toxins to aquatic systems. Acid, bases, salts, metal compounds. Where do we go? Where do they come from? Industry, household, surface runoff, and mining sites. To continue on, sediment disrupts photosynthesis, food webs, and other processes. Where does it come from? Soil and silt. Land erosion is that source. Heavy metals can cause cancer, disrupt immune and endocrine systems. Examples, lead, mercury, arsenic in the water. Where do we get it from? Unlined landfills, household chemicals, mining refuge, and industrial discharges. And thermal, all right, actually makes some species vulnerable to disease. What is thermal? That's heat pollution in the water, electrical power, and industrial plants. So for instance, before they closed down the nuclear power plant up at Indian Point, that was a point source pollution, that all the hot water, again, we talked about how in nuclear plants, right, the water is used to cool the nuclear rods. Well, what happens is that water then gets hot, right, as the energy is transferred from the heat is transferred from the rods to the water, and then they discharge that water into the Hudson River, or they did before Indian Point closed down. But that actually disrupted the ecosystem because the animals, the organisms in the Hudson River aren't used to intense heat in the water, right? So now you put this heat in, and that's actually a form of water pollution as well. And again, electrical power and industrial plants, you could put nuclear plants in there as well. All right, so please have a good idea of this chart, major sources of water pollution, their sources, what they are. All right, definitely understand what's going on this table 17.1. Okay, moving on. What are the major pollution problems in streams and lakes? So, many streams and rivers around the world are polluted. Now, streams can actually cleanse themselves of biodegradable waste if we do not overload them or reduce their flow. So, believe it or not, streams are actually very good at cleaning themselves. That's because the water is in constant motion. That then eventually dilutes any pollution that is in there, moves it around. If there is an oxygen dead zone, the water continues to move and continues to cycle some of that oxygen in there, which basically, if you have a dead zone in a river, it'll quickly become not a dead zone anymore as the flowing water increases the oxygen. So again, rivers and streams can cleanse themselves pretty good. Lakes, we're going to find out, are not going to be as good as cleansing themselves. Adding excessive nutrients to lakes from human activities, again, can disrupt ecosystems. Real key, guys, preventing pollution is much more effective and less costly than cleaning it up. Once you have a polluted lake or a river, it's very, very expensive to clean up, okay? So it's a lot cheaper to prevent the pollution. We found that out over the last 40 to 50 years. So again, prevention is the key because it's less costly. So let's talk about stream pollution in more developed countries like the United States. This was a big issue back in the 1960s and 1970s. So in the 1970s, there were a lot of water pollution control laws that were put into effect. Successful water cleanup, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, Believe it or not, the Cayuga River in Ohio in the 60s and 70s, in parts of the river was actually on fire, believe it or not, because there was so much oil and gas floating on the top of the river that you could actually light the oil and gas, and the river was actually on fire in places. That's how crazy it was. So it was actually, the water cleanup was driven by a bottom-up pressure from citizens who were like, this is crazy. And so they actually cleaned up that Cayuga River in Ohio. EPA estimates that mining waste pollute 40% of the headwaters of the western watersheds. What are the western watersheds? Those are your watersheds like the Colorado River, for instance, out west. What are the headwaters? That's the beginning of the river system, all right, not the end, but the beginning. And mining waste pollutes 40% of them. The Ohio River, still the most polluted river in the United States. Now let's talk about stream pollution in less developed countries. Half of the world's 500 major rivers are polluted from untreated sewage and industrial waste. Water is often used for human activities, though, in these underdeveloped and less developed countries. And that's why you have that figure of over 1.6 million people dying per year, mainly in less developed countries due to water pollution. Nearly half of China's rivers are too toxic to touch or drink. Liver and stomach cancer linked to water pollution among the leading causes of death. So, this is an interesting picture. These are Hindus in India washing themselves in a river as part of their daily holy ritual. In addition, they use the river to wash their clothes and to get drinking water. Well, what you don't realize, though, is that this river is polluted with animal and human waste. So now you have the river polluted with all this waste. All these people use the river. There's no pumping the river out into some kind of treatment plant that treats the water. They're just using the water as is. You can imagine why you have over 1.5 million people dying per year from diseases from polluted water, because you can see it's part of their culture. It's part of their culture to be in the water, to be in these rivers. I'm assuming this is the Ganges River in India. It's part of the culture. So when the river is polluted, and back in the old days, hundreds of years ago, you didn't have pollution because the river would cleanse itself. But now we've overloaded the rivers with this pollution, and so the rivers can't cleanse themselves as quickly. And so unfortunately, you have human beings that are bathing, drinking, cleaning their clothes, doing holy rituals in water that is polluted with human and animal waste. Obviously, you don't want that. All right, so next thing we want to talk about is something called an oxygen sag curve in rivers. It's a concept that you do need to understand. And I'm going to show you a picture on the next slide, which I think makes it a little easier to understand. But flowing rivers or streams can dilute organic pollutants and heated water unless they're overloaded. So again, rivers do have their own capital, right? Ecosystem capital that allows them, ecological capital that allows them to cleanse themselves, right? Rivers can actually do that if they're not overloaded. Does not eliminate, though, heavy metals or slowly degradable pollutants. An oxygen sag curve is created when degradable pollutants are emitted and bacteria act to decompose the waste. All right, so what does that mean? Here is your oxygen sag curve basically in blue. So here we have a river flowing naturally, normal, clean water. You got your trout, your perch, your bass, your mayfly, your stoneflies in the water. And then we get to this point source pollution where they're either dumping fertilizer in, human or animal waste, maybe it's just sediment, whatever, okay? But the dissolved oxygen, right, because here now what happens is your biological oxygen demand increases in this decomposition zone because now you have this pollutants, which again, the bacteria love, right? So the bacteria or the algae form, the algae die, the bacteria eat up all that algae, right, decompose it, and that pulls oxygen from the water. So your oxygen demand shoots up while your dissolved oxygen sags, all right? Here's your sag curve, right? So this is called the decomposition zone. And basically, pollutant tolerance fishes, a couple can live there, but most animals are going to die. Then we get to the septic zone. Again, I got to remember the river is continuing to move, so it's beginning to dilute that pollutant that has come off of the point source, right? So the sag curves in what's known as the septic zone, where fish are absent, fungi, sludge, worms, bacteria are abundant in here, right? Taking away all your oxygen. This is your dead zone, okay? We could talk about maybe in the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, that's not a river, but that would be your dead zone. But then what happens in a river is as you get farther away from the point source, again, the river is refreshing itself and kind of cleaning itself. So eventually you get to the recovery zone where the biological oxygen demand continues to sink, and therefore your dissolved oxygen in the water starts to increase again. And then finally, at a point far away from the point source pollution, the water is clean again, and you have your regular organisms living there, okay? So that's what's known as an oxygen sag curve, where the pollutant comes in, the biological oxygen demand increases, which then decreases the dissolved oxygen in the water. That then causes your dead zone, which kills a lot of fish, a lot of organisms. But in a river, because again, it's flowing and turbulent, kind of cleaning itself, eventually the pollutant will dilute and your dissolved oxygen, your biological oxygen demand will decrease again, and therefore your dissolved oxygen content in the water will increase again, and therefore you have a normal river once again. All right, so again, this is the oxygen sag curve. Understand what produces it and understand what causes it to go away. And again, it's just a movement of the river which allows it to clean itself by diluting the pollutants. All right, lakes and reservoirs, though, a different story. They are less effective at diluting pollutants than streams are. They have stratified layers with little vertical mixing. There's little or no water flow in a lake or a river. Can take up to 100 years to flush or change the water in a lake, all right? So you do have some water coming in and out of a lake, but a river may take a couple of days just to kind of get new water in there, or maybe even a couple of hours, right? In a lake, it could take up to 100 years to kind of change over the water in the lake. And of course, you have biological magnification of pollutants that occur in these lakes or reservoirs. So let's talk about cultural eutrophication. We have talked about this a bunch in this class. So hopefully this is going to be a review for you. They call it too much of a good thing. Again, what is eutrophication? It's the natural enrichment of a shallow lake, river mouth, or slow-moving stream caused by runoff of plant nutrients such as nitrates and phosphates. Now remember, an eutrophic lake has little nutrients and clear water, but now you put a lot of nutrients in an eutrophic lake, and unfortunately now you get the eutrophication to occur, which because you have now high nutrients, and that causes that algae to bloom, right? So cultural eutrophication is when nitrates and phosphates from human sources, again, our culture, all right, produce that eutrophication or that algae bloom. Again, where do we get it from? Farms, feedlots, streets, parking lots, lawns, mining sites, and sewage plants can all add these nitrates and phosphates to the water. That then causes the cultural eutrophication or that algae bloom that, again, as the algae dies, the bacteria consume it. That bacteria then consumes all of the oxygen, and then you end up getting a lake or a reservoir that has a depletion of oxygen. Fish can't live, end up getting a dead zone. During hot weather or drought, again, kind of went through this just now, but you got that dense growth of algae and cyanobacteria, oxygen depleted then by the bacteria that decompose the algae, and that then produces your dead zone. Prevent or reduce cultural eutrophication, all right? So what do we need to do? Remove nitrates and phosphates from our fertilizers and recycle nutrients into the soil instead of letting them on top and then having them run off into lakes, rivers, and reservoirs. So what are some methods to clean up lakes? Again, it's very expensive. Once you pollute something, it's much more expensive than just preventing the pollution in the first place. So you have to remove excess weeds. You have to use herbicides and algaicides to kill the algae in the water. You need to pump in air, because if you pump in air, what do? You increase the oxygen in the water, right? You increase that oxygen, dissolved oxygen, if you pump in the air. Most lakes will recover if excessive input of nutrients is stopped. But again, it takes a lot longer in lakes and reservoirs for that to happen than it does in streams. And here's just an example of severe cultural eutrophication of Chow Lake in China. You'll see this all over this area as well, especially in the summer. Look at any ponds or lakes in the Westchester area here, and many of them in the summer you'll see looking like this, basically green on the top with all that algae. All right, final couple of slides for part one here. We're just going to look at a case study about pollution in the Great Lakes. In the 1960s, many areas in the Great Lakes had cultural eutrophication with fish kills and contamination. In 1972, however, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was put into effect. Basically, newer upgraded sewage treatment plants along the Great Lakes, which decreased algae blooms, which increased the dissolved oxygen levels, which then increased the fishing catches. So it helped. It helped the ecosystem in the Great Lakes. What are we talking about? The Great Lakes, all right? Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, the 5 Great Lakes. That's what we are referring to here. Bans on phosphate-containing household cleaners did help as well. However, there are problems that still remain. Increasing non-point runoff of pesticides and fertilizers still the greatest threat to water pollution of the Great Lakes. Atmospheric deposition of pesticides, mercury, and other chemicals from as far away as Mexico and Russia. What does that mean? Well, that means that you have these pesticides, mercury, and other chemicals are picked up with the wind and actually put into the atmosphere. Then the jet stream carries those around the world, or those pollutants, where they eventually then deposit or deposition, come out of the sky and deposit in water somewhere else. So again, we're seeing that with chemicals, pesticides as far away as Mexico and Russia ending up here in the United States. 25% of fish in the Great Lakes had unsafe mercury content at some point. Again, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, another project, $1.3 billion provided between 2010 and 2015, focused on reducing toxic pollution, cultural eutrophication, loss of habitat, invasive species, and soil erosion, and it promotes wetland restoration. Again, those wetlands, that buffer zone, act as a natural way to get rid of pollutants. So you take away the wetlands, the pollutants go right into the lakes. You promote the restoring of those wetlands. Then as the pollutants come from the rivers into the Great Lakes, they hit the wetlands first, which again dilute or basically clean a lot of the water, natural capital, that then goes back out into the lake cleaner. So that helps. And again, the preventive approach, all right? Call for a ban on toxic chlorine compounds used in pulp and paper industry and anything else, all right? The idea is it's a lot cheaper to deal with pollution before it happens than after it happens. After it happens, it is much more expensive. All right, that concludes part one of my lecture on Chapter 17, Water Pollution. Again, make sure to check back for part two. And as always, thanks for listening.